So welcome to the audience here in the room at DIW Berlin, and to the audience listening in from their computers at home. I'm very happy. It's really a great pleasure to host, together with Marcel Fratscher, the president of the DIW, what I would label a dialogue, an OECD DIW dialogue on a subject that is very dear to both of our hearts. It's social mobility, and our OECD WISE Center, whose director, Romina Buarini, will present our work on the subject in a moment. It really brings together the many dimensions that play a role for social mobility, and after her presentation, we will be able to discuss this with Marcel Fratscher and Sandra Bohmann, who is a researcher taking care of the key data base for this subject, the socioeconomic panel. And as always, you can ask questions from your screens, and they will be come in on a screen here for me, so I can feed them into the debate. But also from the audience, you will be welcome to ask your questions and make your comments. And without further ado, Romina, I give you the floor and the screen, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much to the colleagues in Berlin for organizing this very exciting session. Before I actually go into the very core of my presentation, let me just very briefly introduce you the WISE Center, and this is the center that is now responsible in the OECD for the work on inequalities. We are a new center, so I'd like to tell you a bit about what we're doing. And in fact, I'd like to start by, sharing with you the mandate we have on improving people's well-being. We have a very specific definitions and analytical framework for talking about well-being. And the important thing I want to say here is that in this framework, we're really looking at well-being as a multidimensional concept. So it means that we're looking at the economic and non-economic aspects of well-being. And so actually that multidimensionality is also a feature that we are using to develop the work on social mobility. So this is something that I'm going to also elaborate in a moment during the presentation, that we're not just looking at the economic factors that play a role into social mobility, but also, the other well-being factors that drive social mobility. Very concretely, we have some pillars in the WISE Center, and one of those is measuring what matters. And so we have a focus on looking at many dimensions of people's lives, how they vary across the population. So, what are the living conditions of people, how they vary, but also how they move over time. And obviously, the work on social mobility that I'm going to expose in a minute actually starts with key issues in terms of how we look at it, how we measure social mobility. There are many ways to do that. So again, we really spend a lot of time in terms not just on collecting data that are internationally comparable, but also looking into the technicalities of how we can best appreciate the social mobility from a very measurement perspective, from a very statistical perspective. And so maybe I will also talk a bit about the data challenges that we have as we try to move forward with this agenda. At the end of the day, the work that we do on measurement is there to inform the design and implementation of policies, which is, of course, the core mandate of the OECD. And in particular, the work that we do in the WISE Center is about making sure that we are putting the well-being of people at the very center and the very heart of the design of policies. And of course, we are also partnering with countries very directly to provide direct assistance in implementing those policies. Now, today I wanted to share with you the highlights of a new initiative that looks at social mobility and equal opportunities in OECD countries. And this is called the Observatory, the OECD Observatory on Social Mobility and Equal Opportunity. It's our new flagship on the topic. And importantly, this is something that we launched just a few months ago. And this is really coming from the strategic priorities of our current Secretary General. Of course, the OECD has done work on social mobility and equal opportunities and on inequalities, more broadly speaking, since long time. So, we actually have a pretty long tradition there. But we decided more recently to really sort of deepen our focus and make sure that we would, in particular, go into the development of work that looks at social mobility trends and patterns across OECD countries, because those issues have become even more topical given the current context, socioeconomic context that many OECD countries are facing at the moment. And again, these are elements that we'll elaborate a little bit more on in the remaining of the presentation. But again, it's really important for me to stress that there is a lot of policy attention at the moment in all OECD countries around those issues. The Observatory is organized around 3 pillars. The first is about advancing data collection. I just mentioned, in my previous slide that, of course, we still have a big measurement agenda to develop on those issues. We're lucky enough at the OECD to be able to come up with the first international comparisons of various types of economic and social mobilities, educational mobility as well. But we know that, again, the data that we have still are lacking some important dimensions. Sometimes they're not timely enough. Sometimes they're not granular enough. For instance, we have very good estimates when it comes to measuring social mobility across nations and so at country level, but we are not always able to actually understand the very, very local dimensions of social mobility. And yet we know that in many countries, actually, the most important drivers of social mobility are those that really can be activated by local governments and really with a place lens focus. Of course, as I said, this is the data we are collecting here have to inform policy. So a new, very specific pillar of this observatory is going to do first analysis of the most important policies that can be fostered by governments to break down the barriers to equal opportunities and promote social mobility. We have quite a lot of knowledge already on those policies, the policies that work. I'm going to share that in a minute. But we also feel that this is an area where the OECD can expand its research a bit more. Finally, we are going to have a pillar looking at the broader enabling system, in particular the role that is played by the civil society and the private sector in fostering equal opportunity. So why the topic is so important? Overall, we feel that in all OECD countries, there is quite a lot of room for making societies more mobile. Let me share with you some key data. And of course, I'm going to in particular talk about Germany and how Germany compares on this topic with respect to other OECD countries. So let me start by the data that are included in this chart that you can see, in this slide. And this is looking in particular at the concept of educational mobility. What we find is that 1 in 4 adults actually only have experienced upward educational mobility. So it means that only 1 in 4 individuals in Germany have attained a higher level of education than their parents. And so, that's 1 in 4, and that compares with 39% in the OECD. We also have other estimates suggesting that in Germany, 42% of the son whose fathers was earning relatively low levels of income, so they end up having low earnings themselves. And this is substantially more than OECD average, where this proportion is only 31%. We also look not just at intergenerational mobility, but at the concept of intragenerational mobility. So essentially how an individual is able to get ahead in life and go through the life cycle doing perhaps better or perhaps not better. And here, the concept that we're using is the concept of sticky floors and the sticky ceilings. And what we are finding is that in Germany, people that actually belong to the bottom quintile of household disposable income have a 56% probability of remaining in the same income group after 4 years. Okay, so this is the sticky floor. At the other extreme of the income spectrum, we find that those that they started in the top quintile, so they started in the richest group of the population, have higher chances, 75%, to remain at the top. So there again, we tend to observe that there are very sticky ceilings. Now, we have additional evidence that looks at how those sticky floors and ceilings have changed over time. And there again, the findings from our research suggest that the evolution of that situation actually wasn't very positive. And in particular, let me stress the results about the sticky floor. So we found that the German poor were 11% percentage points more likely to still be in the same income quintile 4 years later. So when you actually observe different generations and different sort of vintages, let's say, of people, what we observe is that the sticky floors tend to be actually a much more sort of worrisome fact. We're also, of course, looking at social mobility and equal opportunities by taking into consideration the very specific characteristics of people. Here, I just talk about, the social gradient. So essentially, we're looking at, the socio-economic background of people and sometimes at the income or the education of their parents. But of course, we know that a lot of the reasons why social mobility are not sufficiently high in OECD countries also depends on things such as racial or ethnic belonging. And in Germany, we've just conducted new analysis that suggests that the people from the minority backgrounds are almost twice as likely to be in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. And this is, again, a proportion that is larger in what we observe in other OECD countries for which we could gather a comparable observation. Now, I wanted to, in fact, emphasize a slightly different aspects. Again, this is about social mobility, but this is based not on the conventional estimates of social mobility and what sometimes people refer to as the objective estimates of social mobility. I want to talk about the perceptions of social mobility. This is an area, in fact, where the OECD is developing a lot of work. So we started looking into the issues of the perceptions and the attitudes towards social mobility, because in many OECD countries, the rise of inequalities has also stimulated a big debate around the strength of the social contract. And so really the perceptions and the beliefs that people have towards the role that the state is playing and the role that the welfare system and many more public policies are actually playing to reduce the inequalities and to be able to provide equal opportunities. And so we started investigating this question, taking, in fact, into consideration perceptual data and in some cases behavioral data. I'm not going to talk about the behavioral data here, but here you have the results of a survey that, in fact, we carried out last year. There is that meta survey, and we included a special model that was actually asking people, so asking OECD populations, what they believe about, what are the main beliefs about social mobility. First of all, whether they think this is a core issue, and also what they think are the main drivers in social mobility. So in this survey, we find out that most people in Germany, approximately 60%, think that, so 60% of the German population that has been, taken part into this survey, think actually that the poor children will grow up as poor children. So, they actually think that the economy and society is quite deterministic. And so those poor children, in a way, don't have a lot of chances to change their destiny. And this is a share that is slightly higher than the OECD average. We also look at, as I mentioned, the beliefs around social mobility and equal opportunities. And we find that a small majority, 55% of German respondents, think that working hard is essential or very important to get out of life. So this is really the meritocratic belief. So it's important to see that still, at least one individual in two think that this is, the really results of getting ahead in life and succeeding in life is the result of the effort that people can put. But there are also many others actually that think that initial circumstances and characteristics that people can't control or are not responsible for, those characteristics are also important to actually determine success in life. And so in particular, we find that, again, in Germany, 37% of people think that coming from a wealthy family is actually one of the important determinants, again, of success in life. Things such as ethnic backgrounds, or sex are also considered to be still very essential or important to get ahead in life. Now, in the current context, of course, the current situation in many OECD countries, which is one where many economies are still reconstructing, they're still recovering from the COVID-19 crisis, is in fact a situation that has accentuated inequalities and possibly social mobility issues, because we know that the shock that was generated by the crisis actually is one that is not necessarily short term. So this is a shock that very often came with what we call scarring effects. So this is actually had impacts on the long term. And this is, for instance, what we have observed on the low paying jobs, but also the labor market. So the reintegration of some very specific groups in the populations that continue to be very, very slow. But this is also what we have observed in terms of the impacts on the human capital. So the human capital accumulation has actually decelerated strongly in many OECD countries. There have been things such as, school interruptions and a number of, very, very important disruption happening in the school system that we know have been particularly critical and particularly challenging for the most disadvantaged children. More recently, as you know, all OECD countries are facing a very, very challenging cost of living crisis and high inflation. Of course, this especially relates to energy and food cost. But again, we have evidence that suggests that actually the lower income households have been impacted the hardest. We also know that the problem with inflation is actually that also leads to households to make very, very hard choices when it comes to some very essential goods. And because obviously that's what they have to still pay for. So they tend to increase, obviously, their share of expenditures on things such as food, obviously warming the house, and so the energy, et cetera. But sometimes that means that they have to give up or sacrifice important expenditures and investments in education or health, which again are quite key to drive social mobility over time. And that is really the current context. But of course, this is not happening in a vacuum. All OECD countries, with no exception, in fact, have been, undergoing through big changes in the wake of globalization, digitalization, but also the green transition. So these are big transformations. These are big structural changes that obviously all OECD economies need to embrace, with a lot of boldness and courage. But of course, those changes come, with some impacts that sometimes are quite concentrated and badly concentrated, again, in the groups of individuals, but also in the groups of territories, in the places that actually have already the largest challenges when it comes to social mobility. And maybe just to share, one data point that is particularly, I think, significant for the German context, and that relates to the point about the digitalization, which is eroding job opportunities. We know that in Germany, 38% of the low-skilled workers and 22% of the middle-skilled workers are, in fact, today in jobs that we consider to be at high risk of automation. And this is actually one of the largest share across OECD economies. So that was a way to set the scene and a way, share with you what are the most acute challenges of social mobility. But of course, the OECD has been quite active as well into the development of policy solutions. And here are, a few policy ideas that actually come from a report that we published back in 2018 that was called the Broken Social Elevator Report. And it was really the first to put the spotlight on the issues of social mobility. And so we had identified at that point in time, 5 big, I would say, families of policy. So as you see, as I mentioned, this is a multidimensional issues that we're looking here. This is also persistent issues. So this is something that again, has characterized economies, and so over long periods of time, which means that, it's not just about, changing one little thing in the system, but actually coming with a systemic, all of the government approach. And so we think that, really improving social mobility and providing opportunities to all requires the actions at the level of health and family policies, education, labor markets, tax and transfers policies, but also place-based policies, including urban planning and housing. So I don't have a lot of time left. I know that in the panel discussion that is going to follow the presentation, we're going to go into the details of some of those policies. But I just wanted to very quickly share with you some fundamental messages about some 3 specific solutions where we are doing a lot of work at the moment, and we think these are important highlights for the governments that want to tackle the issues of social mobility. First of all, obviously, disadvantage starts very early on, and therefore needs to be addressed very early on. Disadvantage tends to be passed on from one generation to another, but also, throughout the life cycles of individuals. So that is something that requires really sort of an attention from the very early years of life, but it's also something that requires continued monitoring and policy interventions. So in order to help governments to sort of prevent the occurrence of the childhood disadvantage, it's important that we do 3 important things. First of all, the issues of providing access to affordable, high quality early child education and care facilities, especially for the children that come from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And let me say that in Germany, big effort has been put into increasing the enrollment rate into those facilities, so into the ISEC facilities. Now, this enrollment rate in Germany is, almost at the levels of the OECD, so 39% of children between 0 and 2 years old are enrolled in those facilities. However, Germany still is lagging behind with respect to other, countries that are really, really doing much better on that front. For instance, if you take the Netherlands, the enrollment rate is almost 70%. So more than 2 in 3 children in that age cohort of 0 to 2 years old actually is getting access to those facilities. So this is certainly one area where we would emphasize that Germany could do a little bit better. There is another important point. This is about making sure that, when we are actually suggesting the improved access to ISEC facilities, we are also considering, of course, the broader role that the families and the home environment, but also the communities can play. So again, it's not just about, opening the facilities, but also making sure, in fact, that the children, in particular, the most disadvantaged ones, actually can be fully integrated in those facilities, but also be fully integrated in the communities from the very, very early years of life. There is another point. This is about promoting the reconciliation of work and family life. So obviously this is key, takes many, many different forms. But I know that in Germany, there's been a lot of debate around these very specific issues. And that, took I would say the discussion. So there was a very specific discussion about some interesting mechanisms, such as the family working time model. The idea is essentially that the parents with young children can actually benefit from reduced full-time hours for a very specific period of time. And so obviously that gives the possibility to the parents, and in particular to the fathers, I would say, to actually, be with the children at the same time, of course, maintain strong connections with the job markets, but, being there to accompany the children in the very, very important initial period of life where, in fact, a lot of chances are shaped for the future. The second solution is about investing in high quality education and training. And so again, this is about, making sure that we're not just stepping in sort of in the very early years of life, but obviously we are also, making sure that the investment in human capital is sustained throughout the life cycle of individuals. And of course, that takes, again, different forms. It's not necessarily about how much we spend into it. It's also how we spend and making sure that really the interventions there are cost effective. That being said, let me share with you that, in fact, the very specific findings of our research have suggested that countries that in the past have spent more on education also tended to have higher educational mobility. And in Germany, we've been looking at, essentially the volume of spending on higher education. Now we have been observing that this is a level that has remained stable for many, many years. So perhaps this is another area that is worth sort of considering. This is not, again, only about the volume. It is also about, the design of the very specific educational policies, and in particular, making sure that these are targeted to the disadvantaged groups. So here we're talking very specifically about adopting well-designed funding formulas to reconcile horizontal equity and vertical equity in education, but also investing in teacher quality. This is really, really an important issue. A lot of evidence coming from many OECD countries that telling us that when you have the best teachers that can provide a lot of value added to the learning of children, especially the most disadvantaged ones, this is really where you can change the odds for those very disadvantaged children. And finally, of course, still quite important point about making sure that, what the educational systems produce, but also, of course, what are, the other lifelong learning systems and training systems do produce. This is also something that is very relevant from a very labor market perspective. So again, very concentrating not just on the sort of educating people and making sure that people graduate and take, nice degrees. This is about obviously making sure that we are investing in the right skills, in the sense that we are actually getting the skills that are needed for finding sort of good jobs, especially in the new context that, as I said, is shaped by very fundamental transformations such as digital and green. And finally, I wanted to include, in fact, on one of the solutions that is possibly the most important one. And in fact, this is an area where we didn't have a lot of evidence until very recently. This is about how we actually limit the very large wealth inequalities and the inherited advantage that many children start with. Why this is not something that the OECD has sort of necessarily looked at for many, many years is simply because we were lacking actually a lot of data on two very specific issues. First is the scale of the problem. So it's only very recently that the OECD were able to compile internationally comparable data on wealth inequality. And secondly, we were also missing information in terms of how much of that wealth inequality again is driving the accumulation of advantages over time, and therefore, limiting, the intergenerational mobility over time. In this chart, you have some data that are quite telling, suggesting that the wealthiest German households are actually 5 times more likely to receive an inheritance or a gift than the households that belong to the bottom of the income distribution. And so you can see that there are other countries in the OECD that do worse than Germany. So again, I wouldn't say that this is only unique to Germany, but it's certainly, this big gap that I just mentioned, this, 5 times sort of gap is something that, of course, has to be addressed. There is another dimension to it, which is essentially to what extent the very low-income people have buffers, have wealth that make them resilient, to shocks. And we have, again, a new report that is going to be published very soon that looks at income instability, but also income instability and, again, the resilience of households in the face of income instability. In that report, we find that in Germany, 2 out of the 5 lower income individuals that we have observed were lacking sufficient liquid or financial buffers to cope with shocks. Okay, so again, it means those households essentially are really, really badly equipped to be able to resist and withstand big shocks where, there are big crises. We have done work that suggests that there are policy interventions that are very helpful to limit wealth inequality, but also to make households much more resilient, again, in the wake of economic shocks. Those include support to vulnerable, lower income and lower wealth households. And that support in particular means to be able to help those households to save and to accumulate wealth. There are a number of interesting, very specific policy interventions and mechanisms, so including in Germany, that are done, for instance, to help poor families to attract savings, but also, of course, improving the financial literacy of those households, improving the access to financial services, and you name it. So there are very, very many possibilities exist. Of course, there is a very, very important role being played by the taxation system. And I think that in particular, that means looking at it, for making sure that it's neutral, but also very progressive. So I think that we will be able to get back on some of those very specific points. And again, perhaps also looking at some good practices that we have identified in OECD countries, how they can be a source of inspiration for Germany. I'll leave it here, and I look forward to the conversation during the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Romina. And I'm now looking forward to debate this a little bit with you and then with Sandra Bohmann and Marcel Fratscher, who will join me now on the, in the panel behind the table, however you want to call it. So that was really very interesting. Thank you very much, Romina. And I think, you made it very clear how social mobility is really a multidimensional issue. But I think the first question we have to ask our data experts here who manage the socioeconomic panel is perhaps, perhaps I start with you, Marcel, the diagnosis. So of course it's very difficult to measure social mobility and even more difficult to have good comparable international data. But this diagnosis that Romina just presented, so that it seems even a little bit worse in Germany than in other countries, is that something that you would also basically sign, or would you say that's what you find as well, or would you say, well, it's so difficult to compare international data that we don't really know?
First of all, with the GSEP, the Socioeconomic Panel, we obviously only focus on Germany. My suspicion is that the OECD data also, for Germany, also is using some of the GSEP data that we have been developing. No, I think the international comparison, as far as I know and I understand the methodology, is really well done. So I think I have no doubts about this comparison. So first of all, a big compliment to the OECD and to the center. This is really important work. And it's important because what I see often in the debate, not just among academics, but also in the policy debate, is it's so hard to benchmark. It's so hard to say what's actually good and what is bad. What should we aspire to? What should we achieve? When can we talk about a problem, or when is actually something going quite well? And that's why this international comparison is so important. Now, what I find striking, this is very much also what we see in the GSEP data, is that social mobility in Germany is relatively low. In some dimension, it has actually decreased. For instance, in the persistence in staying in the same income group, the bottom quintile or top quintile. So this very much matches what you have been presenting. Maybe to advertise some of the work we have been doing at the Institute also in the past, we find even stronger evidence, for instance, on the mobility or the dependence, the intergenerational dependence. And what we found in some of our studies in the past is that 50% of the difference in income of children is explained through two factors. income of the parents and education of the parents. So this is just going one step further, Romina, than what you have been presenting on this correlation with income. And actually that is as strong or explaining as much as, for instance, in the United States. So when you show these numbers to people in Germany, often they're surprised and say, well, this is very different from our perception. And in Germany, we have the perception, we have a social market economy, it's very fair, equality of opportunities very high. And I think what we are doing at the Institute, and that's why this work by the OECD is so important, is to kind of actually say, well, that's actually different from what the numbers tell us. And maybe social mobility is not as high. And so I'm grateful, again, to the OECD that to highlight this. And as I said, this international comparison is important because it makes it harder in Germany to say, no, we don't have a problem, everything is fine.
So, Sana, you have really worked also on this data, the socioeconomic panel, and so Romina showed several data sources, also PIAC data, etc. So she showed this educational dimension, and you just said you basically can pin down the sources of stickiness in some ways to income and education. But are there other dimensions that are important, or what are the different dimensions? Do you also have this multidimensional approach? And what are the most important dimensions that determine social mobility or immobility in Germany and other places, in your mind, based on this research?
Right. So, yeah, if we talk about social mobility, I think, well, education is, in Germany, is the key factor, because what we see is that, like, if there is mobility, it often happens basically during school time, and there is much less mobility basically after, schooling has finished. So if we want to get at social mobility, we really should focus on early ages and on educational mobility, I would say.
So these you picked the right dimensions also from a German perspective, Romina. Perhaps I would like to have one round in picking up this idea. So the COVID crisis, of course, is sort of behind us in some ways, but of course, if we say education is particularly important for social mobility everywhere, but also in Germany. And we know that the socioeconomic gradients in terms of schooling results is particularly steep in Germany. So what your PISA results, for example, depend more on family income, family education, family background than in other places. And Romina, perhaps I want to play this a little bit back to you, because you talked about the problems that children had to endure, young people had to endure during COVID, and of course, for example, school closures, where we saw them a little bit everywhere, but they were particularly long in Germany. So I don't know what does your research suggest here? What needs to be done, basically, to make sure that the COVID crisis doesn't leave a lasting impact on social mobility?
Yeah, thanks for this additional question. Yes, as you said, I mean, the school sort of closures have been long, well, in Germany, not only in Germany, in other countries too, but the other, I think, dimension is not just the length of the closure. Is actually when we had data that was looking precisely at the different changes in regimes, over the 2 years of the crisis, where obviously many schools were, not prepared to manage the crisis and essentially had to come up with very creative solutions from one day to the other, but also throughout the different stages of the crisis. And so it's not just a question of duration. I think it's also just a question of, instability in those regimes. And obviously, I think many governments really sort of played, the best they could. So they were sort of experimenting, I think, with those regimes. But the reality is also that, that instability didn't help with the learning, because obviously the children and the teachers and, the whole institutional system had to, cope with that, very, very sort of organic environment. The other point I wanted to say is that, again, is so in many countries, we saw that it's really the most disadvantaged children or the disadvantaged communities and schools, and that relates to the problem of having, in many countries, but I think it is one specific point of attention for Germany, having in a way a lot of this segregation, because you have a lot of disadvantaged children being enrolled in disadvantaged schools. Okay, so they're not sort of, let's say, distributed evenly across the system, but they're really just in some schools, and so those in particular obviously have suffered the most. And so what can we do about it? Governments already have tried to do something about it. So, in many countries, you see that it wasn't just, back to business as usual, but in fact, for some of those very disadvantaged schools, the children, special programs have been introduced with the idea, of course, to compensate and mitigate, those losses in learning. The other element I wanted to say, and maybe this is something we should do more, when I'm saying we, I'm thinking about all OECD countries and governments, is not just looking at this from a very, very educational or strict educational perspective. This is not just about the schooling and the learnings. One of the outcomes, or one of the results of the crisis was not just in terms of what the students have learned or not learned, but actually the very, very alarming increasing levels of mental health that we observed, especially for the youth, not for the very young children, but the one that the adolescents essentially, and so we have seen that there've been a number of essentially an increase in many of the symptoms of depression, anxiety in that group of the population. And this is not always something that has been fully understood by governments and by the schools. And so the problem is that we will need to have integrated intervention that, again, is not just looking at the skills and the cognitive skills, but also actually come with also an ability to support the mental health and the mental distress of the children and of the adolescents. So I think that is something that perhaps government could do more, not just concentrate again on the basics, I would say, of education, but also have this broader holistic perception or an understanding of the inputs on the well-being of the youth, and making sure that very specific mental health services are being delivered and channeled through the school, because obviously the school is still the place where things happen, as I think one of the panelists was saying. So school can do a lot, but obviously they need to be helped by the governments to do that. We can't ask to the school to do all the job. They need to be supported in many different ways, financially, but also with obviously real knowledge on how to handle those new mental health issues that were brought about by the crisis.
You had a question.
I wanted to pick up one point you made in your presentation, Romina, and try to understand a bit better what's behind it. And that's the analysis you presented on the minorities and why the income ceilings and floors are so much more sticky in Germany than elsewhere, in particular on the upward mobility. This is 3 times smaller in Germany than in other OECD countries, if I understand it correctly. Now, the narrative in Germany often is, when we highlight, and we have done that at the Institute in the past, quite often to say, look, income mobility actually has gone down. And the response to that often is, yeah, these are migrants. They're coming to Germany and they're just, that's their responsibility. I'm now paraphrasing very briefly, but basically saying this is entirely a story of migration and they're hard to integrate, and that's why they get stuck at the bottom of the income distribution and don't get out of it. And my question, you can ask whether, why should that be so? Why should be migrants different from people who have been born in Germany and don't have a migrant background? But in particular, this international comparison would be good to understand, to highlight, the sources of that, but whether that narrative is really true. Why should, first of all, you're talking about minorities, and this might include people with a migrant background, but it might also include other groups. That's my first question to you. The second question is, do you have an analysis that highlights what the reasons are why minorities in Germany have such harder time to be mobile, be particularly upward mobile? Is it integration? Is it the educational background? Or is it simply the framework, so the conditions that minorities have in Germany? So in other words, are the people responsibility, or what is inherent in the German system that we could improve to improve upward mobility?
Yes, sorry, I wasn't looking for how to unmute on my screen. So the very I would say definitional question in terms of what is that we consider minorities in this analysis. This is actually indeed all different type of minorities. It's not just ethnicity. And also in fact is a question that allow people to self-identify as minority. So they can say whether, it's based essentially on questions where people self-report to say, yes, I do feel I belong to this, minority, and they can say what sort of minority is, or whether, this is an ethnic minority, it is a minority that is specifically related to immigration status of individual, because you can be an ethnic minority and yet having live in the country for many years and many generations. But we make the distinction between there, and we have other type of minorities being considered in this analysis. For instance, the religious beliefs, the gender, etc. So that chart that I was showing to you was actually looking at all. Okay, so it wasn't specifically looking at ethnic minority. On the other question, I think, in fact, we haven't done the analysis, so it's a great question you ask. To what extent, the limited upward mobility and the increased sticky ceilings. This is only an immigration story, so I don't think we have done the analysis that will allow us to come with a rigorous answer to this question. So I think it's an interesting discussion you are having on this, and maybe in the future we'll do more work to address that very specific question.
And it is a good question where more research is needed. Perhaps in terms of the, I want to come back to the schooling and what you showed, and perhaps perhaps also in combination with this question about minorities, immigration, etc. Because Romina, she mentioned, or she underlined a lot the role of early childhood education. And she showed that spending is a bit, as a relation to GDP, is lower than elsewhere. But then the problems we are grappling with here in Germany at the moment were another surge or several surges of migration. Indeed, OECD data show there that the concentration of children with a migrant background actually in schools has increased. So that may be another explanation in some ways. Although this is recent, that wouldn't explain social mobility in the longer term. So there's the spending, which is difficult to increase because now we are spending more on military. There's various other crises that we have. But also there's a very acute skills crisis in education. So lack of personnel for early childhood education and care. And so my question is, are these issues even solvable after COVID? We don't have personnel. Children are in greater need of having the support from schools or early childhood education and care than perhaps before. Can it be even done? What's from your perspective? What do you see in the data, and do you see policy levers that can be pulled to address this problem? Perhaps you want to go first and you can back up.
So, you're addressing a real problem, because if there are no teachers, you can't make them up. So, one So yeah, from my perspective, it's the policy debate we currently have in Germany in the Kultusminister conference of, making teachers do more hours is certainly going to be detrimental to social mobility, because it's exactly the kids that need the teachers most that will probably be most affected from, teachers in schools that are typically sort of very demanding schools, having to work even more hours where they are probably already at the edge. And then we know, for example, from Berlin, that it's especially the schools that have a very high percentage of immigration children that have the largest losses of lessons due to sickness. And I mean, there is also a mental health sort of threshold where we can push teachers too. So rather than pressing teachers, it might really be helpful to get in other sort of groups of professionals into schools and employ more, social workers, more school psychiatrists, more people doing administrative work, and get as much work as we can away from the few valuable teachers that we have, and allow them to really do their work, and concentrate on the teaching. And maybe one thing that Hamburg, for example, has the Sozialindex, so a social index, which basically ties the number of teachers in a school to the number of children below poverty threshold. So there is a direct sort of investment where we need the investment, which we don't have in other Bundesländer. So
Yeah, Marcel, I would like to pull you in there, because you often argue that enough money has to be invested in things like infrastructure, but also social spending. So one thing is the money, but what do you do with the money if you don't have the people? Of course, we have some answers already, but I'm just my question here is, I think, what combination of spending for the right things and social innovation in some ways do we need to be able to tackle this really acute problem or challenge of looming social mobility problems in the future if we don't act now?
Maybe just to add 2 points, one on the education system, one also on income and financial safety for families, because also Romina touched upon that prominently on the wealth dimension. And the income dimension. The first one is, we talked about early childhood education. We had at this institute a lot of work over the past 10, 15 years highlighting that, in particular, how important early childhood is. So in terms of the education system, we still have in Germany a system that puts a lot of responsibility to the parents. And since 2013, we have an entitlement for parents to set for a kita, for daycare. But for instance, for a full day school in primary school, the entitlement is only from 2026 onwards. So currently there's a lot of weight on parents, basically, when kids have problems in school, to compensate that at home. And that's one big source of inequality. That's what we see in the study. So that's another dimension. I mean, it's of course, if you have already now a problem to have enough teachers, enough personnel in schools, and this will become even bigger. What I'm saying is, what makes Germany really special is that a lot of responsibilities with the parents, and that's one source of inequality. Now, the second point I want to make is maybe moving to also something that's important in the current policy discussion and something that Romina also highlighted on wealth and on income. Maybe 2 points on that. First, you showed this inheritance chart, and Germany is really special about savings and wealth in the sense that we have 40% of households who basically no wealth, no safety net, particularly in crisis times, and that's very peculiar to Germany. We have a very high degree of wealth inequality, and in particular what makes us special is that there's so many people who don't have a safety net, if you wish. The second point that on income is, we have currently a controversial debate on the Kindergrundsicherung, and something we have as an institute always argued to say, look, you also need to equip parents with enough financial means so that they actually can access some educational offer. I mean, one typical example is in the COVID crisis, the lack of electronic equipment for kids to actually participate adequately in online schooling. And this is just one very specific example, but particularly this issue of Kindergrundsicherung, how do you actually equip parents with sufficient financial means is an important one. And this is a big issue at the moment in Germany. Depending on how you calculate that, it might cost 10, 12 billion euros extra every year. But from the perspective of educational opportunities, equality of opportunity in the education system, also equipping parents with sufficient financial means is an important dimension. So from that perspective, the Kindergrundsicherung would be a very wise investment.
Mm-hmm. Romina, the Kindergrundsicherung is sort of an enhanced child benefit, right, and targeted more towards poorer families. So, and I think that brings us into an interesting debate. I think full-day school, the notion doesn't even exist in other OECD countries because it goes without saying that it's full day. But here we talk a lot still about half-day, full-day. And I think building on what we discussed, I have two questions for you, Romina. One is perhaps a little bit the balance of financial benefits, financial transfers, benefits for poorer families to equip them to promote their children's educational success and later economic success. But on the one hand, and on the other hand, what we provide in terms of support in schools in early childhood education and care. You can't say what's the right balance, but do you need both? Do you need more what's being provided in school? Also, with respect to another question I have, because I'm always puzzled that this question of social mobility through generations is looked at in terms of fathers and sons. And I'm wondering about mothers and daughters. Have you looked at that as well? Because one issue also when we look at financial means, etc., here in Germany is it's one of those countries where many women do work now, so employment rates are high, but actually many of them work only part-time, which can become a problem when your family dissolves, etc., etc. So about this balance, benefits, financial benefits versus what you provide in school and full-day school, how important is it for the social mobility of women specifically also? Because if they have to take care of everything, education of their children, it's more difficult for them also to build a financial, to build some savings, for example, for old age, etc. Perhaps you can elaborate on that.
Yes, I mean, very, very many and very complex questions, so I won't, do justice to all of them, but let me try. First of all, I think it was interesting to hear about the point on, do we have enough money? And if we have the money, how do we spend it, right? And I think that's one of the issues with social mobility, that it's not a mandate that is for one, department all in the government. This is, again, something that many needs to look into. That also adds to the problem, right? And including because this is not something that will provide benefits in the very short term. So, this is the type of social investment that you have to construct over the years to make sure that, again, it produces the benefits. But it is a social investment. So I think I wanted to rejoin the point that was made about, this, let's think in terms not of investing in physical infrastructure, but also in social infrastructures, because yes, it's costing today, but it means it will cost less tomorrow, because tomorrow you're not going to have to, pay for essentially the lack of investment and essentially pay for, the negative outcomes that come from disadvantage and perpetuation of disadvantage sort of over time. I think I'll perhaps talk first about the gender question, because I think it is a very interesting one. And it's so to some extent easy to answer when we're talking about the data, because the reality is that in fact the large majority of the international evidence on social mobility does rely on surveys essentially that are carried out for families, but where essentially we have the answer that is given by the father. So we are able to essentially to come up with correlation of earnings or of degrees over time, but that only looks at the correlation between the father's earnings or the father's degree and the degree of the earnings of the children. Okay, so and that we can differentiate boys and girls, but when it comes to the head of the family, we only have the information from the father. So that is quite interesting. Or I mean, it's also not only interesting, but it's certainly a blind spot because of course not only today we have a number of different sort of family situations, arrangements, etc., but because we are also obviously in merit of gender equality, try to sort of encourage women to obviously be more active in the labor market, etc., and we don't necessarily know the effects on social mobility. Although for some countries we do have evidence actually that when it's mothers' earnings, that is quite positive, especially for boys. But it's limited evidence, and so I think we need to do more work on that. Then the questions about and also before I go to the balance question, I think the point on gender is clear also when we're talking about the having the possibility that families and parents sort of obviously do also their jobs. So when it comes to social mobility, and exactly the point was made that yes, but maybe too much burden is put on them, and they have a number of responsibilities. And so how do we actually unlock that situation? And I think the change in the gender sort of roles within the family can be very helpful from a perspective, because indeed I think the fathers could be asked to do a little bit more, which probably would be positive on some aspects, including for social mobility. And so I think there is a question: how do we find the gender to family policies and things that of course relate to unpaid care leave, etc. Redefine the gender roles in a more sort of
Okay. I think we've lost her, which is too bad, but she'll come back, I'm sure. We'll be back. And in the meantime, so I still have this also, it's also something for the online audience. I always have this sentence here on my screen. No questions from the online audience for now, but I do have a question from the audience in the back. Could we bring the lady in? Yeah. And another one here in the front, so we can try to handle the questions amongst ourselves. Yeah, hello, no, actually, sorry, if I just, the lady in the back was first, and then it's your turn.
Thank you. Evgenia Barbang is my name. Is my name. I wanted to ask, you mentioned like socio-economic background as a very important or essential criteria, like family income and education for social mobility. And in the name of the institute or social research institute is also the word inclusion, and it's include also people with disabilities. And I'm a bit missing this point. Do you regard that disability is also an essential factor that affects social mobility? And did you study what barriers do people or children, young people with disabilities face in the educational system, on the labor market? And sorry, it's like a bit a few questions. For example, in Italy, this is a good example where the school or educational system is quite inclusive, like it has historical reasons, but after leaving the school, young people have much lower chances on the labor market if they have disabilities. So it's also not guarantee an inclusive educational system that you like use this social elevator, just some few questions.
The one problem we have, because you said that you probably were referring to WISE, that inclusiveness, does it include inclusiveness vis-a-vis people with disabilities? And I think the answer is yes, and I'm actually not sure what the minorities include that Marumina talked about, but we don't have her online now for technical reasons. But I don't know, does DIW do some research about labor market opportunities, education opportunities for people with disabilities? Can we pick it up a little bit, or is it something where we have to say, we'll look at it? It is important. We do it, yeah. Please.
I think if we always study the chances or the barriers for people with disabilities like separately, it's rather exclusive. So my point is not only to focus on the social, sorry, I'm very nervous at that, social economic background, but also always to have it in mind that people with disabilities also face, like it's also a very essential factor at this point.
I think it's a good point. Yeah.
I don't know. Do you know whether we are able with the ZEP to go into that much depth to do, or whether this has been done by someone else?
I'm not sure if it has. I mean, it has certainly been done by someone else. We have the data in the sub, so we do have the question, I think, on whether you get a percentage on disability. We also have like long-lasting diseases, but I don't know of any colleague in the House doing, like, focusing specifically on that topic.
It's very, I mean, the ZEP is great. We have 30,000 individuals, and it's representative for society overall. What we are struggling with it, even with 30,000 persons that are being covered, the numbers for each group and also for people with disabilities is relatively small. And then to do an analysis related to mobility is even more difficult. So we have looked at certain very small groups. For instance, we have done some work 2 years ago on LGBTQI groups and how they are affected, but this is more on the labor market, less on the educational side. And already that is a struggle because the groups become very small to do the analysis. So to be honest, we have to look into it. I'm not sure whether this is possible or whether it has been done.
It's an extra module even, no, for LGBTIQ, or is it? Yeah. So sometimes you have to extend. But there was a gentleman in the front who also had a question. So please.
Yeah, hello, how are you doing? Hello, yeah. My name is Razan Najat from Mizi Group. Now, at these days, everybody is speaking about hydrogen energy. Yeah, and as my knowledge, there is many study about how using hydrogen energy in the mobility. Yeah, but in the reality, there is nothing. Yeah, can you say me why?
What mobility are you talking about?
Yeah, hydrogen energy, using hydrogen energy in the mobility.
In transportation? You mean transportation?
Hydrogen, Wasserstoff.
Yeah.
You're talking about
transportation.
Transportation, I guess.
Yeah. Transportation, private transportation, and social transportation. Yeah, because the buses they can using hydrogen too. Yeah, the train they can using hydrogen too. Yeah, the cars can using hydrogen too, and there's very big idea and very big item in these days. Yeah, because everybody say about the energy and renewable energy.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and we do quite a bit of work on different transport modules, renewable energy, but now on the social mobility, clearly, I don't know how to connect that now politely. But
social mobility should be clean too.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a bit of a different issue, but maybe we can go back. It's too bad that that Romina isn't there anymore, because I wanted to go back to the now more the fiscal, financial dimension of the wealth inequality, right? And so Romina was talking. Oh, there you are, Romina. We lost you, but you're back. So. Well, one question I can pick up again, because it was directed to WISE, basically, that came from the audience, was about, the many dimensions of vulnerability. To what extent do you also look in this context of minorities that you said? Does it include people with disabilities, or do you have work on people with disabilities? That was one question.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. In fact, there is work on disability being done. It's not done by WISE, but there is another group in the OECD that has been very active on this. And that work essentially consisted of looking how disabled people are doing on many aspects of life. So whether their well-being outcomes, are shaped by their disabilities. The answer obviously being yes. And so just to give you some numbers, I think, to illustrate the issue, the fact that, so essentially being education, being income, being employment and life satisfaction. So essentially disabled people tend to do less well and much less well on all those aspects. So I repeat them, education, income, employment, life satisfaction, than people that are not disabled. The young people with disability are also more likely to be early school leavers. And I think that is possibly an interesting connections with social mobility, right? Because again, this is speaking obviously about the educational chances that they have, and obviously we know that clearly the school attainments and outcomes are so important for driving the mobility, economic and social mobility later on in life. So I think this very specific data point is an interesting one to consider. And in general, that disabled people tend to essentially have lower income in their households as compared to ones that do not have disability. So I think we have those stats. Now, there is actually some countries that are now stressing a lot. They're putting really disabilities and disabled people at the very focus of the policy efforts. There was, a social policy and employment ministerial organized not too long time ago in the OECD, and in those ministerials, so the minister of the OECD really wanted to do more, which I think obviously is so encouraging. Specific work and analysis on disability and social mobility doesn't exist yet, certainly not in the OECD. So this could be one of the questions that we will address in the future. In fact, we're going to start a new project that looks at discrimination, and within that, we're going to look as well at the discrimination of disabled people in terms of not only how objectively those people are discriminated, but also how disabled perceive and experience the discrimination. So this is something that, in fact, we're doing work on at the moment, and so we will be happy to share the results, when we have the report that is ready to be published.
Will do. That's great. But I want to come back to this other dimension, which was wealth inequality, and you mentioned different policy levers, and what's discussed a lot in Germany, heated debate, right, is inheritance tax or taxes on wealth. Let's say they're different. They come in different shapes and forms, of course. You also mentioned, very importantly, I think, support for people without any savings to build them. That's a particularly difficult one. And there's also OECD work on financial literacy. And I think, there's almost a popular movement now in Germany that wants to have financial literacy, a national strategy. And also this has been taken up by the finance minister and the education minister. So something may be coming. Perhaps I would like to ask you, Marcel, how important are these three levers? You know, how important is this in particular perhaps to build, because there are many people with very little savings, how to help them? With some financial support, with financial literacy support, what is needed?
I fear people with very low income, low wealth, you won't help with financial literacy. Of course, that's important. But if you look at what I described earlier on, that we have 40% of the households with no savings, net savings, I think you have to get at the root causes. And the root cause is clearly a relatively large low-wage sector, relatively big share of the population, about 20% of employees work in the low-wage sector, so earning basically effectively less than €13.50 per hour. And for them, it's very hard to make ends meet. So in the short run, there's very little you can do to really address that, apart from better wages. I mean, that's really the most effective way to help people build income and savings, is better working income, better wages, and that's tough. Now, in terms of financial literacy, what makes Germany very different from other countries is the way we save. Germany is a country with very large private savings, just that they're very unequally distributed. But it's also that relatively few people hold home ownership. We have about 50% home ownership. If you go to the big cities like Berlin, you have more than 85% of citizens renting, having a massive increase in rent, and thereby making it even more difficult to save if you have to pay a higher share of your income for housing. So, you know, that's where the financial literacy comes in, to help people save in a smarter way, where they actually can accumulate savings, is important. But again, we're talking more about the middle class, right? Helping people acquire housing, maybe equity ownership, which is a long-term investment. That's something for the middle class. It would help, but it certainly would not address the issue of, let's say, the bottom 30% who have very low wages, low income. So there the answer must be they need a better education system, more support through social security. So there the scope to really tell people, help yourself, save smarter, is not really there. That's where social security comes in.
So we're coming back at the end, because unfortunately with our time we're at the end to where we started, income and education as key dimensions for social mobility. Romina, it was great to have you, if only on screen. Next time we'll bring you to Berlin. It was inspiring. It showed also with the questions from the audience. Very little questions or no questions from the online audience today. That's unusual. How many dimensions there are to social mobility. I think it would be worthwhile to continue the conversation, not only between the DIW and the OECD. We should bring in other players, but in any case, I learned a lot. I hope you did too. And with that, I wish you a very sunny and happy rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.